Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 32 months, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Repke, and this is the BILD Situation Room. We start with footage from Western Russian regions, which shows that Ukraine is exercising its right and its permission from the USA, now using Western weapons against strategic military targets in Russia. We start again with footage from the day before yesterday, showing what is probably the very first ATACMS strike in history at a Russian target. Here we see footage released by the Ukrainian army, supposedly showing the launch of 2 out of a total of 6 ATACMS missiles in Ukraine. We then observe footage coming from the city of Kurakhove, which is located in the western Russian region of Bryansk. And these recordings show us that for the first time, here we see it, a massive explosion occurs on the horizon. Some individuals captured this on film during the night. This explosion is allegedly showing an ammunition depot that was struck in Bryansk. So that was the first ATACMS strike, both Ukrainian. Not entirely official, but well-connected bloggers report this, as does the Russian Ministry of Defense, which clearly says 6 rockets were used. Allegedly, 5 were completely destroyed. Another one was reportedly damaged by an S-400 system. However, we can clearly observe that these are fictional claims because it's evident that there have been actual impacts and secondary explosions on the ground. That means the targets were met here, and the ammunition depot in Kurakhove in Bryansk was relatively clearly hit. And that was merely the initial attack with Western cruise missiles and rockets. It was mentioned right the day after that the USA gave permission to both the UK and France, allowing them to deploy their respective cruise missiles, namely Storm Shadow or Scalp EG, for use against Russia. And Ukraine acted on this yesterday, implementing this within hours after the permission was granted. And this event occurred in broad daylight, which explains why we have detailed footage from Marino, a small town situated in the Kursk region. And let's just take a moment to listen in, or rather, so let's simply listen closely and hear the evident panic of the resident who is, as it happens, capturing the entire situation on film. We hear all around him the sounds of these explosions occurring here, and we can clearly see this is the smoke billowing up and rising over a military facility that has been struck in this instance. And of course the Russians say this is terrorism, that it's aimed at civilian targets. This is what Ukraine, known as the so-called Kiev regime, is doing in an effort to tyrannize the local population. Yes, we have further footage from a Ukrainian surveillance drone which flies completely undisturbed over Kursk, over the small town of Marino, and this footage shows us exactly like here in total. 12 Storm Shadow cruise missiles find their target, and definitely not in the civilian section of the city, but rather in a designated military installation. Here you can observe Marino from above once again. Feel free to fast forward a little bit, and we can quite clearly see that here on the right side, we have the large buildings, various high-rises, that we have a sanatorium here, a kind of castle, and that we also have an underground communication facility here, a large bunker of the Russian army that is actively being used there for strategic communication and logistics in this region, undoubtedly also for the defense of Kursk, where the Ukraine has been conducting and executing its operations since August, that this is specifically intended to direct the communication flow. That the smoke primarily rises up here. And interestingly, we also hear, or we observe in the intervals where we just heard the explosion coming from the city, the gentleman who captured this footage did it from approximately this location here, situated between this castle and the large houses of the city. We can see how new impacts are continuously occurring all around this bunker. And these are clear pieces of evidence that show us that these impacts, as we see on the left side, were carried out very precisely, that this Storm Shadow hit with an accuracy of just a few meters. When operating optimally, yes, if they face no interference, they can accurately strike their targets within just a few short meters. And in total, we are witnessing 12 explosions occurring with 12 British Storm Shadow missiles, all impacting one after the other, precisely right here in this Russian army bunker. We don't know yet, but there it is. The explosions are precise, always at the same spot. These aren't secondary explosions, very important. No ammunition is stored here. These are new Storm Shadow missiles hitting there, aiming for the location to shut down that system over there. At the end, the drone zooms in a bit closer. This means we can get a bit of a picture of the damage, but of course we can't see what was affected underground. We can only take a closer look at a few buildings at the moment that were impacted and sustained damage at the upper level. But we don't really know what it looks like underground. Here you can see it. This is the communication facility of the Russian army, where at least several buildings on the surface have been destroyed. How the damages are underground, whether the goals have been achieved, that's not visible to us right now. We're going to examine additional footage recorded from last night. There were explosions once again in the western part of Russia, and this time they occurred in the small town known as Kamenka. That's another city situated in Voronezh region, and reportedly it appears that a nearby oil factory has been hit here. The Russians say that only mayonnaise was being produced there. The Ukrainians say no, this factory has switched its production since the start of the war to important parts for kamikaze drones. Now we're observing these explosions happening right here. These aren't Western weapons, at least not any Western missiles or rockets. They are actually Ukrainian drones that impact here. But we also notice this precision and the consistent ability to repeatedly target this specific factory. This means that the Russian air defense systems appear to be very strained or even potentially overwhelmed in certain specific regions in the western parts of the country. We observe that Ukraine is actively employing a diverse array of available weapons to effectively carry out these attacks here. Let's take a closer look at this scenario on the map. We have just discussed the locations Marino in Kursk, Kurakhove in Bryansk, and Kamenka in Voronezh. And we can see that all three of these cities are relatively close to the border. So that's a maximum of 70-80 kilometers away. This means theoretically other weapons could also be used here. However, we just noticed that it was relatively clear that drones or actually cruise missiles were indeed utilized in this situation. We can also observe from the distance perspective that the potential of the attack EMs is definitely nowhere near being exhausted yet. We can just quickly show it again. So it's about these 300 kilometers here, there we've displayed it. That means, theoretically, the ATACMS could shoot up to here. The Storm Shadow even up to that. Red line there of 560 kilometers. That is about the range the German Taurus would have if delivered, a decision the Chancellor persistently continues to oppose at this present time. Nevertheless, as we can see, these are military targets, at least critical targets for the Russian military infrastructure that have been hit, and the claims or warnings from some German politicians from the far left and right, one would now be risking that Ukraine might attack civilian areas, something which has not been proven true so far. We move further into Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine, into the Donetsk region, and unfortunately we have footage showing us that the Russian army is advancing on the ground despite massive losses. We observe the footage coming from Nowa Ilinka near Kurakhove, an area that the military forces aim to capture. Now, at the outset, we observe how the Russians are employing drones and heavy artillery, which are likely FAB-500 aerial bombs, showing how they are deployed, how Nowa Ilinka is heavily shelled, and how, in the end, the Russians triumphantly raise their flag directly in this small, secluded fishing village and proceed to celebrate having successfully captured it. And Nowa Ilinka, that is familiar to me personally, because in mid-September I actually stayed in one of those houses we just saw, in one of those houses myself, when we reported from Kurakhove previously. Now we see how the Russian army, just the 114 brigade, has proudly raised their flag here and is celebrating the event lavishly, once again making it abundantly clear that at least in the northern region, they have nearly bypassed Kurakhove directly. Across the reservoir, you can see the other side of Kurakhove. Unfortunately, from Kurakhove, we also have confirmation that the Russians have advanced further within the city, meaning they have now brought about 25% under their control. We can see the Russian flag being hoisted up in an industrial area situated in the eastern part of the city. As is often the case, the eastern parts are taken first, and then they move towards the center and towards the west. The Russian Naval Infantry Brigade that was strategically deployed here has successfully taken control of this specific area. We'll see again in a moment, as the drone pulls out a little further, that we have one last natural obstacle, like a small river or a swamp area between the two districts, the eastern and the central, which hold the Russians back a bit here, and also explains why the Ukrainian army has retreated behind it, because better defense opportunities are seen behind it. But now I believe it's rather clear to make out when you take another look at it again. Right here, exactly. Pause for a moment. Right here. The end of the eastern district. Now we have this marshy area here, and right behind it start the large buildings, including the industrial facilities and the skyscrapers of the city, where the Ukrainian army is currently still holding everything. Nevertheless, Kurakhove has been partially captured. The Russians are advancing further here, and we take a look at the map to see that the situation is absolutely critical for the Ukrainian army in this region. What we just observed were recordings taken from the north side of Kurakhove. Nowa Ilinka is located approximately here. That means this is roughly the 1500 meters distance we took back then, also with our team from the city, because the city was heavily shelled and we could oversee everything quite well from there, without putting ourselves in absolute danger. And Kurakhove itself, as we have come to understand quite well, is indeed the part of the city which is presently under Russian control, and the Russians had just seen it here, at the very western part of this area. Importantly, when we were there in mid-September. The front was about 8 kilometers further east. That means the front was located approximately here. It was still relatively safe to be there, even as a Ukrainian soldier. And at that time, 2,000 civilians still lived in Kurakhove. By now, most of them have probably fled. And we can see that the Russians are not only present in Kurakhove itself, but of course also a bit further to the south. Continue to expand and establish their presence further here in Dalnya and are actively moving towards Uspennivka, heading in this particular direction, with Uspennivka located right at that specific intersection over there. And if this small town were to fall, it would mean the end for all other settlements in the south of Kurakhove, as they are currently still held by Ukraine. Even so, conditions aren't exactly ideal for the Russian army. Some new footage shows that their advances in Ukraine aren't being carried out with armored vehicles anymore. No longer tanks, no longer Chinese vehicles, but instead Ladas, civilian Ladas, are being used, which are partly intended to secure advances, so-called mechanized advances in this area. And these are truly incredible tasks that we see here from the Ukrainian army, which show us that the huge losses of just in the last 10 days, 120 tanks and armored personnel carriers in Kursk, so in the western Russian Kursk, that they result in, at least in some front sections, the Russian army now. We observe it here, restricted to civilian vehicles like Lada and Gaz, in an attempt to storm the front lines with them, which of course ends disastrously deadly for the entire troop formations, those involved. We cut it out as soon as you see, after the first round with the wheels here, after the vehicles were destroyed. Earlier it was, I think, 4. Now there are 3 in this attack. After the vehicles were destroyed, almost all infantrymen who were wounded take cover to the left and right and then be killed by the Ukrainians. Still, these remain really impressive shots, because you wouldn't expect that the second strongest army in the world would end up using Ladas now to approach the front here. We also see 3 loaders are under attack by the Ukrainians, actually 4 in total, with 2-3 down there and 1 further back. And we will now see various drones being used on these vehicles, and in the upcoming footage, which was taken without thermal vision, we will see relatively good again that the vehicles have now been abandoned. So the Ukrainian drone pilots are first taking care of it. Here we see it, first taking care of it, that these Lada Niva, that's the name, which you can even buy in Germany, that these Lada Niva are now being rendered undrivable for the time being. And following that, over here to the left, which we naturally won't be showing, we'll take care of the dismounted and partially already wounded soldiers of the infantry. So we are witnessing here how these grenades are being released and seeing how, in the end, the entire military unit situated right here from the Russian side was ultimately wiped out comprehensively by the Ukrainian drones. We're moving further south in Ukraine to the Zaporizhia region, where we have information, specifically video information, about 2 long-range attacks. First, a Russian long-range strike on a home artillery of the Ukrainian army, which we also want to take a look at. It should also not be hidden that the Russians are achieving successes here. Here we are observing a column consisting of 3 vehicles in total, in the middle. There's a home-based artillery piece, a mobile version, which is being closely escorted by 2 accompanying vehicles. And now we see how the Russians have this relatively well in sight, and now we see a Lancet drone. Here we can take a closer look at it. Here it comes, initially maneuvering behind the vehicle to get in the ideal position, and then following the road from the back, it directly crashes right into it. And the whole thing probably leads to damage, though not complete destruction, because otherwise the Russians would certainly show it. Here we can see the Lancet starting its attack, now flying in. It apparently hits the vehicle, and we'll very soon see another angle of it. Here on the right side, we need to focus on where the same attack on the same vehicle is about to be shown again. Here we see it from behind. That means we have an impact, but the Russians stop filming right after, so we can strongly assume that there wasn't any significant damage here, that the vehicle no longer stopped or pulled over to the right. Nonetheless, a Lancet makes a strike on a HIMARS artillery piece positioned in the Zaporizhia region. And we stay in Zaporizhia, also in the south of the country, and here we look at footage showing the destruction of another Russian Buk M1 system by Ukraine. And this time, no HIMARS and no precision artillery or anything like that is used, but instead a kamikaze drone is employed, specifically a Western one, probably of the Switchblade 600 type, even though it's not entirely clear due to the pixelation. So here we observe once more the vehicle that was the target, and now we notice the launch of one of these kamikaze drones. Below here is the catapult serving as a kind of launching pad, and we will soon witness the drone rising up from it, although it's difficult, almost impossible, to see right after it leaves this tube, where its wings do unfold. You can barely track it. Here, we now see it, the sleek and very modern drone flying by. The approach, whether it uses AI or not, isn't clear, but we see the drone adjusts continuously. So where is the goal? Where am I? And accordingly, the whole thing gets adjusted here. As I said, it's not clear whether it's with AI or if there's a pilot at work. In any case, we see that we're experiencing a precise hit. This is most likely the Switchblade 600 from the USA making its impact. This weapon still tries to drive away. We can see it clearly here, it's moving. However, one of the rockets was hit, and we can observe that during its movement, while the operators are sitting inside, the rockets from this Buk M1 system explode, meaning we have one less threat for the Ukrainian army in the southern part of the country. First, let's look at another innovation from the Ukrainian army, namely a kind of drone mothership, so a carrier drone that carries other drones with it. And this is a really interesting video because it shows us for the first time how. This drone of the Dovbush type, that's what it's called, how it's being used. We see here a relatively large drone with about 3 meters wingspan. Below here, still somewhat hard to see, but it will soon be clearer. There are two. The quadcopters are securely strapped underneath. They hang dependably from the drone's wings, waiting patiently for the drone to arrive at the designated target area so they can then be carefully lowered or released there. But we also see these small black parts here. Supposedly it can carry up to 6. Currently 2 are attached. Theoretically 6 fit. We see it better here. So these are the holding mechanisms. You can clearly see the first ones here. Others are positioned on the outside, and we can see that these quadcopters are fully armed. They're currently hanging upside down. You can observe the antenna located right here, and the battery is situated over there. We can see the drone itself here, and over here is its specific payload. What this means is that there are small grenades attached, which the drone employs to hit the target or dives directly into the target using these grenades. And this is a test flight. Nevertheless, we are now seeing these 2 drones being dropped one after the other, and then attack the respective targets. We then see another split screen where we can see what this little quadcopter sees. And that's quite exciting because apparently even now, as we can see here, control has been taken over one of these quadcopters. Now we see it filming the world upside down as it's hanging that way. But as soon as it is released now we see it, the propellers start. It's initially in free fall, stabilizes now, we see it on the left side and is then ready to activate the respective target, in this case just to completely attack a test target. And this has various advantages for the Ukrainian army. For one, of course, you have 6 FPV kamikaze drones at once, and these 6 drones are not operated by a drone pilot nearby. Now we see the approach to the car. Here below we can see it, as mentioned, a test target. That doesn't need to be directly controlled by the pilot, but by this drone, which first, when you attack them, there are no human casualties. Now we see the second drone being released. And the whole thing, of course, significantly extends the range the Ukrainians can attack with, because we can be quite certain that this carrier drone here also functions as a relay station or as an amplifier modem, if you will, thereby increasing the range of these small FPV kamikaze drones. The issue arises on final approach with these small kamikaze drones. As soon as they fly over the horizon from the operator's view, so if you no longer have direct eye contact or radio contact with her, the communication often breaks off. However, if you have this drone up at a high altitude, it acts as an amplifier. Now we also see that the second drone is attacking the same training target here. If that happens, you'll achieve a significantly greater operational range and much lower risks for the drone pilots, thereby enabling the possibility to strike Russian targets with 6 small FPV kamikaze drones over a substantial distance away, without putting at any risk the health and overall safety of the Ukrainian drone operators at any point in that regard. We're seeing a lot happening in the field of drones right now with continued innovation. And we also know that Germany will deliver 4,000 AI-controlled kamikaze drones to Ukraine in the coming months. In this sense, there are several significant new problems for the Russian army.